Thanks, everyone, for staying to the end. We tried very hard to sort of save the best to last, to try to keep you here. And I always, at the end of the conference, say that you are the Anawim, the faithful remnant of Israel, who are still here at the end of the conference. So we're grateful, but I think you're in for a treat. Our last panel will be on the question, Intrinsically Connected. The relationship between religion, ethics, science, and the practice of medicine. And our first distinguished speaker for the morning is Lori Zoloth, who's the director of the Brady Program in Ethics and Civic Life, professor of Medical Humanities and Bioethics at the Feinberg School of Medicine, and professor of Religious Studies and Jewish Studies at the Weinberg College of Arts and Sciences of Northwestern University, a woman who wears many hats, many hats. She did her undergrad at Berkeley, PhD at the Graduate Theological Union. She's the past president of the American Society for Bioethics and Humanities, really working as she does at the interface between science and religion. She's been on the NASA National Advisory Council, the International Society for Stem Cell Research Board, the Society for Scriptural Reasonings Board, the Society for Neuroethics Board, and chairs the Howard Hughes Medical Institute's Bioethics Advisory Board. She's written or co-edited 4 books, numerous articles, and continuously reminds me that I don't read enough Levinas. But without further ado, we'll bring to the podium, and please join me in welcoming Lori Zoloth. Thank you.
Well, thank you both for staying and also for inviting me. It's an enormous privilege to be here. And I wanted to say thank you for Far and Dan, who have transformed medicine in Chicago by this conference, but also by their great and inspirational work. The two of you are always an extraordinary inspiration to me. I mean that sincerely, about a way to live a life, a way to create a praxis that is noble and courageous. And I continue to learn from you. It's always a pleasure, and I always say yes when you ask me anything, to do anything or go anywhere. So there it is. This holiday is, for extra points, not only Memorial Day, but Shavuot, the holiday in which the Jews all around the world will celebrate the reception of the Torah at Sinai. So I thought it was appropriate to begin with some Torah study, some scripture that we share. A fairly odd and obscure passage, but take a moment to read it, please. Deuteronomy 22. You shall not watch your brother's ox or sheep go astray, and hide yourself from them. You shall in any case bring them again to your brother. And if your brother is not near you, or you know him not, then you shall bring it to your own house, and it shall be with you until your brother seeks after it, and you shall restore it back to him. In like manner shall you do with his donkey, and shall you do with his garment, and every lost thing of your brother's, which he has lost, and you have found, shall you do likewise. You may not hide yourself. You shall not watch your brother's donkey or his ox fall down by the way, and hide yourself from them. You shall surely help him to lift them up again. The world in which we find ourselves, the world we are given to live in, is a broken place. We lose things for one, even our coat, even our animals, without which we cannot live. In a textual world, the scripture that I study as a Jewish moral philosopher, it is a matter of such serious concern that it is considered with great care in the passage above, how to respond to the ordinary, tragic losses that we see all around us. The losses in the scriptural passages are the sort of things that happen in an instant and engulf your brother in great grief. First, it's likely that a person only has one ox or one garment, and the getting of a new ones may be economically impossible. Read it as if it says, you shall not watch your brother's car go astray and hide yourself from it. Read it as if it says, in like manner shall you do with his computer and with his one winter coat in Chicago. Then you get the idea. And secondly, catching and returning an entire ox is not a trivial matter, nor is it to care for it until the owner is found. And finally, pretending it's not your problem, that you're not an oxen catcher, or you don't even know the guy, the loser in question, is not an option. He remains the loser as your brother until the act of restoration is accomplished. And in the text, it's his need for the recovery of the object that names him as your brother. You're responsible, even if he's far, even if you don't know him, for his restoration, no matter what it takes and no matter how long it takes. It is a remarkable claim in a time of economic collapse, when we're so very quick to turn from the plight of the others, the losers. And throughout the Hebrew Scriptures and the text of the New Testament and the Quran, we find this particular problem discussed, that we have to be concerned about the particulars of the tragic losses of others, when we know them, when we don't, when we're guilty of their wounds, when we have nothing to do with causing their pain. We are still participants. We are witnesses to the event of their loss. And for theologian Stanley Hauerwas, witness and solidarity may be all you can do. The garment's lost. You must just guard it in the hope that your brother will return. And the garment is then never lost as long as that hope is never lost. You, the reader of the text, are the force that keeps loss from deepening into finality. But you're largely doctors or nurses or researchers, chaplains, so it's perhaps the case that a more complex moral gesture than mere witness is required of you. In this sense, what's being asked by the admonition of the text that you must not hide? What does watching imply doing, standing forth, becoming responsible in the utterly, endless way you must? And of course, the repetition of the command not to hide recalls that first of all demands in Scripture, to be responsible, capable of saying, Hineni, here I am. It recalls that in Genesis, when Adam and Eve try to hide from their inquisitive yearning to know the world through their own touch, that first gesture of scientific pragmatism. Now, we're going to return to that puzzling story. But however, this small passage is one of the internal justifications for medical intervention in all of Jewish thought. If, goes the argument made most recently by Elliot Dorff, you must return a lost object to a person, surely you must return lost health to him as well. And that brings me, by a rather long introduction, a circular route, a route that perhaps suggests the kind of return I'm thinking of, to the nature, goal, and meaning of a project that came to be called Oncofertility Research over 6 years ago. And that was a project in which we were trying to restore the lost fertility of women facing cancer chemotherapy and radiation. A tricky scientific gesture. I will think aloud about how religious moral philosophy and textual arguments were used, and wonder aloud about whether the work that we do in bioethics as scholars of religion can even remember its prophetic tasks sturdily enough to make a difference in the overwhelming logic of positivism, the logic of the market that medicine presents us with. I was the PI for the ethics project, and I'll describe just a portion of this experience as an example about how religious texts address the problem of medical research. It has long been the contention of the field of bioethics that we stand as a kind of outsiders to the moral work of medicine described in the last panel, raising the questions of the stranger to the practitioners of the research. And if this is the case, and in some way I do believe it is, then religious ethics takes the ever more strange questions, impertinent questions of meaning and human purpose, difficult and dangerous questions of why, and difficult and risky discussions that recall things, by the way, that all patients know, which are the stakes of the questions, the persons who will bear the real cost of research and treatment, and the tragic loss at the heart of medicine itself. The Academy, from the Greeks of the 5th century BCE through the 1600s and Bacon and Kant and the entire 18th century, assumed that religious questions about wholeness and causality, had a central place in human knowledge. However, since the rise of the German and then post-Civil War American university system, the hallmarks of the university and of medical research became skepticism and not belief, and the method of knowledge to understand the increasing smaller parts of wholes, and to ask questions about how and what, but never why about the natural world. So I want to focus us on the dangerous questions, both in a descriptive and normative way. And first, I want to describe to you just one of the many ethical issues that emerged in the last years of the research, and then extrapolate some other issues that are yet to be fully considered, and then finally offer some norms that grew out of our attention to Scripture that I suggest are needed if the research was to proceed ethically. The premise of medical research is mastery of the contingency and befallenness of mere biology. And I would argue that this returns us to the text I begin with. Suffering presents an interruption in being, a meaningless takeover of reason, and this rupture creates an opening, argues Emmanuel Levinas, that allows a subject to respond, and in responding, creates the only possibility of humanity and solidarity and loss in a tragic world. You witness the loss. You cannot hide. You must do whatever you can to restore the lost object, in this case, a lost capacity to the person in need. But what are the limits of such need? If what is needed is not a simple act, keeping the cow, but one that is both highly technical and taken in violation of rules and norms, like oncofertility, how should the work proceed? Oncofertility and other projects in advanced reproductive technology deconstructs fundamental human narratives in the service of restoring bodily integrity. Once scientists remove gametes from the bodies of persons to so-called protect them and take them and then put them to use in a lab for which money is exchanged and from which potentially new people can be created, then a complex moral act with many new moral actors makes a new narrative. But what are the limits on science, creativity, and technique? Is all possible? We considered many other ethical issues in this process. For instance, if there's any information that would be permissible to withhold, how to tell the truth about very bad news, how to describe uncertainty, how are pediatric cases different from adult cases, what are the issues of lesbian couples who wanted the technique, or the special cases of the dying. And in this work, we struggled finally with the role of outsiders. For one of the ethical challenges, we found that we, too, believed, as Harold Shapiro, former president of Princeton and former chair of the National Bioethics Advisory Committee, that Dan is in charge of, says, science is a magnificent achievement of the human mind, and the manner in which scientists order the facts of the natural world is often full of subtlety and beauty. As a cultural activity, science can be a great source of hope for humankind. It is not enough, however, to be in awe of science. It is critical to understand both its promises and its limitations. Like Shapiro, we came to trust and then to care for the scientists we watched. And as we did, challenging became far more difficult, but then far more important. Because if we could not raise the deepest and most fundamental challenge, why are you doing this, in the same fearless way that a scientist went over the hardest questions, what are we doing there in the first place? Americans yearn, I believe, to live decent lives. And we've come to both see scientists as the powerful champions of that yearning, and yet most of us outsiders are realistic about the pressures of the market in science, the increasing danger that the economic crisis would destabilize funding, the pressures to produce research that can be sustained. What does it mean exactly when religious texts are brought into contemporary dilemmas in the most experimental science projects, such as this one on oncofertility? We have a genuinely new capacity in the world. We can study and then create human eggs from ovarian tissue. It's a thing that's never been done before. But is it permissible? What sort of knowledge is it? Whose lives will be altered? When we insist on ethical questions, especially the ones that emerge from religious texts and traditions that call on duties to the larger society, we go in very different directions from the products that grants seek to create. After years, for example, of this oncofertility project, newborn is a new thing in the world, we were then asked by the NIH to evaluate the success of the conception of oncofertility. Have we collectively advanced human understanding of the process of the natural world, they asked me. Is the project self-sustaining? Is the technology under the marketplace system that pays for healthcare via insurance credible to the funders? I don't know. I hope we've made the moral case that it could be defensible in some situations, but that's not the question. The question I was more deeply interested in is harder to make a deliverable to the NIH. Does this project create a better moral life or not? Now, I've shown a little bit of how the basic research of Jewish decision-making exists within a complicated, sophisticated intellectual tradition and other work, in which the rabbinic sources clearly demonstrate a facility with knowledge from a variety of sources, and in which the question, how do we know, is answered by a variety of replies, sometimes analytic, sometimes anthropological, based in a study of customs, sometimes linguistic, based in narratives. The traditional sources from which legalistic decisions are drawn in Jewish law does not just provide us with straightforward answers to complex decisions, but they model instead a form of Jewish analysis which considers community values, philosophy, story, logic, and above all, argument. The discourse of Jewish ethics and philosophy intertwine with legalistic analysis, and it is in this odd overlap, this intellectual space, that Jewish bioethics then resides. Ethics is the first philosophy, notes Emmanuel Levinas, meaning it was the quotidian, daily relationship between people that precedes any abstraction about being itself. Thus, our work in this oncofertility project was animated by several relationships that overlay the scholarship, and that raised the bar. In terms of the sort of questions we raise about science, I began to wonder if we can say that while the questions in the project might be similar, even familiar to many others we've raised in bioethics before, but the effort to raise them in a collaborative manner seemed to me to be different. Would they really listen to us if we began at the beginning, as they said? Now, philosopher Christine Korsgaard notes the relationship between agency, action, and self-constitution. Her framework, that your acts make you, sheds light on a way to understand this relationship between self and history and story and act. And that's something what I mean when I talk about ethics and rationality and law, meaning the practice that shapes an ethical response becomes who you are. We are, says Korsgaard, as did Kant, and I would add Maimonides and Buber and Levinas, we are persons who are possessed of a plight, which means we are creatures who cannot not act. And this reality, called in philosophy necessitation, is particularly in evidence when we're confronted with suffering. We make choices to do actions. Actions are the objects of our choices. And acts are choices largely for their ends, which then we can deliberate about. But the act and the end are only part of the action, which also includes a will, a reason for acting, and then law that motivates and may be understood as divinely important and good and inevitable. And in this sense, action is also chosen for its own sake, for nobility in the Hellenistic sense, or imperative in the Kantian, or in the Torah sense for Jews. It is this that renders our lives worthy of value and makes the activities and the science, in that sense, holy, meaning having the quality of this elusive partnership that is the basis of tikkun olam, or repair of the world. Our actions are not only self-determinative, they are world-determinative. What sort of world we will create is the question lying behind all emerging science. It must be the core ethical question, even for projects that seemingly are as good as oncofertility. Bioethics rests on the perfect principle of a liberal theory of the good. We're told to do good, which we rationally judge as the beneficent act based on a tradition of normative Western values. You avoid harm, which we take to mean avoiding error, accident, and the inevitable loss of human interaction. We're told to support autonomy, which in modernity comes to look at the capacity for endless choice despite physical or social limits. But there are underlying problems with this, as many have pointed out. I argue that the example of advanced reproductive technology is fraught with such problems. I've said that I believe that there is a duty to repair that which you've broken, or witness to be broken, in the sense that this scriptural passage argues. And I've said that the restoration, if possible, of bodily integrity, as opposed to bodily wholeness or completeness, might, under certain defined circumstances, involve the research and treatment of infertility secondary to cancer and its treatment. But let me raise some questions about the limits of even this claim. And the questions are largely drawn from the work of Harold Shapiro. First, we have to question whether a powerful treatment for infertility is good to develop and to use in an expanding circle of cases without regulations or limits. We have seen, for example, the use of sperm in IVF clinics to allow the creation of groups of siblings of 150 members, a profound and nearly unique phenomena in our species. What would be the limits on the number of oocytes brought to fruition or fertilized for one individual, and who should decide? What are the limits on the exchange being brought in by the language of autonomy? And second, what's the meaning of the language that surrounds infertility, the longing for a child of one's own? What is meant when we, as Hauerwas notes, say that having a child is the one important way to signal that our understanding that the future will not be ours to create, that it belongs to these children we love and raised, not to us. But this idea surely extends to the care of all children, beyond the borders of the ones we call ours. How does the deep and sustained attention to fancy advanced reproductive technology support the enlargement of our moral duty and the recognition that the children we love do not have to be the children whose genes match ours? And third, what moral limits should there be on any human activity? Are there impermissible human activity? What are the moral limits and what regulations or responses are needed when the bodies of others are suggested for the repair of harm, as for the use of surrogates in ART? What moral limits can be set on the extraordinary problem of the market in so rare and so valuable an entity as a gamete? And how can the temptation of the market be resisted? And fourth, is this a new technology that so expands the range of things we do in medicine that it then becomes a thing of which we ought to seek a just distribution? And when does this intervention become a necessity, and who should decide that? And in a world so burdened with primary infant and maternal mortality and orphan and starving children, and 1 in 5 children in the US suffering from hunger, would it ever be justified to question the research imperative or the duty for integrity that I've argued for? And given the research of some of these people who preceded me in this project and I worked with, what are the limits of safety on human capacities to do research with long-lasting effects? And how are these unknown risks borne and by whom? And finally, since science is a social activity and it cannot serve everyone's interest at the very same time, it is inevitably influenced by ideologies and conflicts of interest. And how are these conflicts uncovered and challenged? So considering these limits, which are serious, taking these questions seriously calls for more than a list of regulatory practices and ways to enforce them, though it will need that too, of course. It will call for other principles. It will call for theopolitical norms and the economy of other deliverables, ones that are intangible to the NIH. For all of science is a debt relationship to the other. Surely the researchers in the field of advanced technology are deeply in debt to the patients and families who've offered their bodies and their gametes, and most of all, their deep hopefulness. So what does responsible conduct in research look like? Is there something intrinsically religious in that? I believe there is. We have a duty to heal the ill and to save lives if we can, and to care for them if we cannot. It is this duty that animates advocacy of medical research. For Jewish law, it is an overriding a priori duty, taking precedence over other ritual or practice obligations, even like Shabbat observance. This obligation is not only a Jewish premise, it is one of the internal, intrinsic goals of medical research. And I've noted before, also one of the broader goals of medicine. In other work, I've extended this duty, and I would argue that it ought to be also an ethical goal of a minimally decent civil society, to care for the other. It is regrettable that this duty tends to be isolated, given off to others, to physicians and the dwindling supply of nurses. But the taking on of this obligation to one's neighbor broadens our understanding of both who the neighbor is supposed to be and who we are supposed to be for the neighbor. In the philosophy of Emmanuel Levinas, I am transformed by my duty to answer the call of the neighbor. I am the one who must come up with the goods, he says. Each must participate in the duty to restore. One must not hide. For Levinas, we must answer the call to help and heal with our entire social goods, with our bodies, our skins, if need be. My life is to be defined by my service to the most vulnerable. What might occur in the debate about fancy technology if we took this philosophic claim to heart? It might help us to understand that altruism is a good and possible human endeavor, and to see the moral virtue of gifts instead of fearing coercion or worrying about ownership and property at every single step of the process of research. The moral universe is so constituted as to be unstable and violent and failed without one step towards the other. And that is a step we must make, because it is possible that we are made whole ourselves only by that gesture as well. In fact, it is this radical recognition of utter insomnia, utter responsibility, that allows us to break out of the paralyzing and deadening idea that the pain of the other is not my problem, that it can simply be ignored, hidden from, that the stranger is really not your brother or your sister. The duty to repair comes from the facticity of the broken world. Understanding that one cannot fix with science the aching loss at the core of human life, our contingency, our fragility, allows humility to enter the practice of science. But understanding that you must pull the arc of the universe towards justice yourself allows science to find its humanity by attention to the right question. Over the last several years, we have had some settled questions, to be sure. The research is then justified by appears to gender equity, veracity, equal justice after harms, and the claim that patients' assessment of their situation of risk bears critical weight, a sort of limited post hoc use of autonomy as assessment. We agree that technology has to be judged in context. We agree that some use of some technologies are morally permissible for the ill, that are not morally permissible to others. You shall not watch your brother's donkey or his ox fall down by the way, and hide yourself from them. You shall surely help him to lift them up again. The text in this section of Deuteronomy is in many ways a repairing of events and stories in Genesis. That's how Deuteronomy works biblically. If Adam and Eve sinned, perhaps it is in not trying to acquire knowledge of the physical world or in seeking to fill up a new hunger. Perhaps they sinned because they were hiding when the thing had gone wrong. We, not being in Eden, just know this feeling, the great loss of cancer, the brokenness it engenders, even in the face of new prospects for containment, draws researchers to the duty of repair. And as research comes to repair, I would ask for 3 commitments: to fidelity, to hospitality, and to justice. Fidelity meaning that you will do what you say you will do and never promise more than your solidarity. In a world so uncertain and in research conducted in the midst of tragedy so fraught, we have little really to offer to patients as patients? Not yet. Research is only the gaze, the observation, trying to see in the dark. What we have, we argued, is fidelity. This principle works on all levels. I promise to tell you the truth, to tell you everything I know. In the text that I used here, we used one cannot be the only narrator of the story. But I would call on you to go beyond even that. Will you promise to stand with the research subjects, whatever the outcome, and for however long it will take? Will you tell them the truth about the limits of repair? Will you be faithful? Second, hospitality means that what you have, who you are, must be shared, for the poor are entitled to the corners of your holdings. This onco-fertility project was a national model in this because the project was so structured as to also have projects for the poor, and that meant that the labs were opened up to the children of the poorest in Chicago, a rather remarkable moment, and one of the strongest aspects of the work. One should be a part of all research, I would argue, not tangential to it. Scientists and ethicists and citizens live together in a moral community, tied in 1,000 ways to our past and a shared vision of the kind of society we would like to become by accountability and the nature of the obligations we have to the interests of others. And finally, I ask you to continue to commit to a principle of justice in the work of medicine and in research. I call on each of you as physicians, as you go forward, to remember most of all the lessons of the Torah, which is the centrality of the poor. For if the research only provides a new social good to the privileged, frankly, it cannot be called ethical. I'm so very pleased to have come, to have been asked to raise questions and to do what Socrates said that moral philosophers do, sting, worry, and call you to impossible standards and to the most utterly idealistic goals. Because I know you are the sorts of persons that will be challenged to get to those goals, that you will stake your life on it. A bit of a counter to the marketplace model, and it's here in this room. I'm glad you know that you need to have people around who can tell you that you can't do things that you don't like to do, us bioethicists, and like all good Chicagoans, when you're doing the right thing, will say, yes, you can.
Thank you, Lori. And again, we'll have the panel as an opportunity for questions. Our next speaker is John F. Haught, who's the Senior Fellow in Science and Religion at the Woodstock Theological Center of Georgetown University, where he was formerly a professor in the Department of Theology from 1970 to 2005. He received his PhD from the Catholic University of America. He's really specialized in questions about science and religion, particularly through the lens of systematic theology regarding cosmology, evolution, and ecology. So we've asked him to make a little bit of a stretch to actually talk to us about medicine. He's written many books. I read the latest one recently, Making Sense of Evolution, Darwin, God, and the Drama of Life. He's the recipient of the Owen Garrigan Award in Science and Religion, the Sophia Award for Theological Excellence, and recently received an honorary doctorate from Louvain University in Belgium. So it's a great honor to have him with us and a privilege, and I welcome John Haught to the podium. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dan. It's a great honor to be here, and I want to thank all of you for staying as well. Dan introduced me as a theologian. I know there are many people here, but not all of you are theologians, so what is a theologian? My definition of a theologian is someone who doesn't make much money, but at least knows why. I should add that for many years I tried instead to become a philosopher, but cheerfulness kept breaking in, and so I had to become a theologian. What caught my eye as I was trying to get my thoughts together on this topic was the first word in the title of the conference, the word responding. And I thought that understanding responsiveness would be at least one way of trying to gather our thoughts together around the question of the relationship between Christianity, medicine, and science. It's a remarkable thing that all three of our traditions share the idea of a responsive God. This is not something that has always been taken for granted in the history of religion. And today, in the age of science, it's especially problematic, as we're going to see. In any case, Christianity is a faith in which the members of the faith are instructed not to think about God, the God of Abraham, without also thinking about the man Jesus. And the gospel portraits, Christian tradition in general, presents Jesus as, you might say, responsiveness incarnate. And it's for that reason that early Christianity, among other reasons, thought of Jesus as the very image of the invisible God, or as theology has said since then, the fullness of the revelation of God. And the roots of that idea are expressed, I think, very interestingly and shockingly almost in a letter to the Philippians by St. Paul, which takes into itself an early Christian hymn in which Jesus is pictured as being in the form of God, but not clinging to that status. He emptied himself and took on the form of a slave. And subsequent Christian theology, not always, but quite often, has interpreted this to mean that what is really being emptied out is the very being of God. So the idea of a responsive God is something that in the history of religion has not always been there. So this is a rather remarkable breakthrough in many ways. At least this is what John Paul II, who is no theological radical, has said in his encyclical Fides et Ratio. He says, the prime commitment of Christian theology is the understanding of God's kenosis, that is, the self-emptying, a grand and mysterious truth for the human mind which finds it inconceivable that suffering and death can express a love which gives itself and seeks nothing in return. So clearly for the Christian tradition, Jesus is, not just like, but is the responsiveness of God to the poor, to the sick, to the suffering, and even to the dead. And so we could interpret from a Christian point of view at least, medical responsiveness to the sick as the responsiveness of Christ. And that would mean the responsiveness of God, God incarnate in medical responsiveness. That's religion. What about science? What do we do with such an idea in an age of science? To dramatize that question, let me begin with a quotation of a stanza from the hymn of the great hymnologist Isaac Watts, written in 1715. There's not a plant or flower below, but makes thy glories known, and clouds arise and tempests blow by order from thy throne. And all that borrows life from thee is ever in thy care, and everywhere that man can be, thou, God, art present there. But look at this rebuttal by Kenneth Boulding, one of the great American minds of the 20th century. In 1975, there's not a plant or flower below, but DNA has grown, and clouds arise and tempests blow by laws as yet unknown. However fragile life may be, 'tis in the system's care, that is nature, system of nature. And everywhere that man can be, the universe is there. Kenneth Boulding is speaking somewhat tongue-in-cheek here, of course. He's a Quaker, but insightfully, I think he's bringing out the essence of what today we would call scientific naturalism, which, as most of you know from your own experience, has a tremendous appeal in the intellectual life, including in medical schools all over the world today. Isn't nature really all there is? Carl Sagan put this very interestingly some years ago, the first words of his book, Cosmos. The cosmos, meaning the physical universe, is all that is, or ever was, or ever will be. Scientific naturalism nuances this to mean that only the world available to science can be spoken of as truly real. Science is the only road to truth. There's no creator because the universe simply is, as Carl Sagan says, and as scientific naturalists in general believe. Obviously, there's no soul, no life beyond death. There's no cosmic purpose. The universe is all that exists, and it works by efficient causation, not by final causation. All causes are natural causes, meaning efficient and material causes. Not only that, but for many scientific naturalists, nature, as it has been laid open so lavishly by modern science, is sufficient to fulfill our spiritual longings as well. So a kind of religious naturalism often accompanies scientific naturalism. Recently, though, a subspecies of scientific naturalism has arisen, and it seems to me to be almost catching fire. Almost every week you see new books coming out making the point that the ultimate explanation of life, and that includes human life and human characteristics such as intelligence, moral aspiration, religious longing, can now be fully explained or ultimately explained in terms of neo-Darwinian biology. So the question is, isn't our own responsiveness a purely natural evolutionary adaptation? Isaac Watts again. I sing the goodness of the Lord that filled the earth with food. He formed the creatures with his word and then pronounced them good. Kenneth Boulding. Is it the goodness of the Lord that fills the earth with food? Selection, meaning natural selection, has the final word, and what survives is good. I can't overemphasize the degree to which in the intellectual world today, at least as I'm familiar with it, has embraced this kind of thinking. Isn't it nature rather than God, science rather than faith? Doesn't science itself support the naturalistic perspective? Look at this new scientific picture of the universe, which tells us that the universe is about 14 billion years old. To try to get some sense of the scale of this universe, I would ask you to picture on your bookshelf 30 big books, and each of these books is 450 pages long, and each page stands for 1 million years in the story. The Big Bang would take place on page 1 of volume 1, and you'll notice that the first two shelves and part of the third consist of what seems to be essentially lifeless and mindless physical stuff and processes. The Earth spins out around the sun around 4.5 billion years ago. Life comes in about 1 billion or so years later in volume 22, but not very enthusiastically, and remains pretty much single-celled until you get almost to the end of volume 29, where the famous Cambrian explosion takes place 500 to 600 million years ago. And then life, relatively speaking, accelerates in terms of rising complexity. Still, dinosaurs don't come in until after the middle of volume 30, and they go extinct on page 385. Which leaves only the last 65 pages for the development of and the thriving of mammalian life, and eventually primates. And eventually, anatomically modern humans, scientists tell us, come into the picture where? On page 450, the last fifth, or perhaps even the last 10th or so, of the very last page of the very last volume. Now, if you're a thoughtful person today, no matter where you come from, you can't help asking the question, what's really going on here? If you're Bertrand Russell, the famous British skeptic, you would ask, if the point of this story was to produce intelligence, why did it take so long to produce so little? Anyway, this picture of this new cosmography seems to add weight to many naturalists' perspective. isn't nature all it is? With all this time, with all the accidents and so forth that take place in evolution, isn't this enough to explain everything, including responsiveness? Notice that this new picture of the universe collapses, or seemingly so, the traditional religious hierarchy, which was a vertical ladder of levels moving from matter at the bottom through plant life, through animal life, through human life, on up through angelic spheres, perhaps, superintended ultimately by ultimate reality and meaning, or what we call God. Now, in this new picture of things, matter, which was the lowest level in the traditional hierarchy, becomes the dominant thing in this new picture of things. Matter, lifeless and mindless matter. Life comes in as a kind of afterthought. Mind pops up just very, very recently. And meaning, to much modern and postmodern thought, seems to be little more than a human construct which we project onto this basically impersonal and cold universe to endow it with some sense of warmth. And that's the explanation for the idea of the responsive God, which our Abrahamic traditions share. Or at least this is the view of scientific naturalism. The clinching argument for the scientific naturalist is the Darwinian recipe for evolution, which consists of lots of accidents plus natural selection and a big, colossal waste of time. How can you attribute any sort of responsiveness when you look for the foundation of this kind of world? How does a responsive God, can a responsive God make sense today, given our understanding of the natural world? Einstein himself told us some years ago that science rules out a personal, responsive God. Doesn't rule out religion. There's plenty of room for religion, but no room for a responsive or personal God. A person who is religiously enlightened, Einstein says, appears to me to be one who has, to the best of his ability, liberated himself from the fetters of his selfish desires and is preoccupied with thoughts, feelings, and aspirations to which he clings because of their super-personal values. He's talking about values such as love, justice, peace, truth-seeking, and so forth. You can commit yourself to those, and that's enough to make you sufficiently religious. And certainly there's a therapeutic advantage to that kind of commitment. Religion is the age-old endeavor of mankind to become clearly and completely conscious of these values and goals, and constantly to strengthen and extend their effect. So there's no conflict between science and religion if you understand religion as commitment to values, or to what the theologian Paul Tillich called ultimate concern. Furthermore, Einstein insisted you can be religious in the sense of cultivating a sense of mystery. The greatest mystery of all, he says, is that the universe is comprehensible. Science can't say why, it simply has to accept that as a given. But that mystery is not personal. The most beautiful thing we can experience is the mysterious side of life. It is the deep feeling which is at the cradle of all true art and science. In this sense, he says, I count myself amongst the most deeply religious people. So again, there's no conflict between science and religion if you understand religion in this sense. However, science is incompatible, he says, and every contemporary scientific naturalist would agree with this. It is incompatible with belief in a personal, responsive God. In fact, Einstein says the main source of the present-day conflicts between the spheres of religion and science lies in the concept of a personal God. Why? Because for the scientist, Einstein insisted, nature is a closed continuum of cause and effect relationships. There's no room, not only for God, but there's no room for freedom either. Nothing can disturb these deterministic laws which have been there from the beginning. So the laws of science apply absolutely in this continuum. And that would mean that divine action by a responsive or personal God would have the effect of interrupting that continuum of cause and effects, which has to be taken as absolute foundational truth by science, by scientific method. A responsive God would simply violate the laws of nature, and the whole edifice of science would come crashing down. There's no room for prayer, or at least for the efficacy of prayer, other than perhaps as a placebo. Einstein, I think, would probably accept Ambrose Bierce's rather sarcastic definition of prayer, which he defines as the request that the laws of the universe be annulled in behalf of a single petitioner, confessedly unworthy. So the key to resolving the conflict of science and religion, therefore, is to abandon altogether the idea of a personal God. And he says, in their struggle for the ethical good, teachers of religion, he's speaking to people such as me and many of you as well, teachers of religion must have the stature today, in the age of science, to give up the doctrine of a personal God, that is, a responsive God. I don't know what your own thoughts on this are. If I were teaching a class right now, I would stop and ask the students, how do you deal with this issue? How do you reconcile, or can you reconcile, the idea of God with the new scientific picture of things? And those of you in the medical sciences, I'm sure, have come across colleagues who would ask you the same question. And it really raises the question whether prayer, whether religion, whether spirituality in the Abrahamic traditions is anything that we can take as seriously true, or is it just simply, perhaps at best, therapeutic? One response, and there are many, in fact, the whole history of modern theology is in a way an attempt to deal with this question. I'll choose as an example Paul Tillich, great American and formerly German theologian who taught, among other places, very briefly here at the University of Chicago, and who actually did write a response to Einstein on these questions, which is quite fascinating and quite impressive and quite nuanced. But I think the essence of it is this. For Tillich, God is not one responsive agent among others that you could identify within the same realm of natural causes that science deals with. Instead, Tillich says that God is the infinite depth and ground of personality. Or we could paraphrase that by saying God is the infinite ground of all responsiveness, including the responsiveness that is taken for granted in medical practice and healing. Here's how he puts it, and this is rather classical in a way. God acts in all beings according to their special nature. In man, according to his rational nature. And I think Tillich would also say in man, according to his responsive nature as well. In animals and plants, according to their organic nature. In stones, according to their inorganic nature. So what that would mean, as I interpret it, is that we should look for the presence of God, or if you want to use the term evidence for God, first of all, in the depths of our own response to suffering. That protest against suffering that motivates medicine originates from deep within us in a conviction that suffering is wrong. But we can't say that unless we also tacitly have some sense of rightness, a sense of rightness, which flows up from the depth of our being and leads us to respond to the poor, the sick, the needy. However, Tillich does go on to say that Einstein's naturalism, and he would say the same thing with respect to contemporary scientific naturalism, including that of what we now associate with the so-called new atheism, Dawkins, Dennett, and so forth, is an understandable reaction to poor theology. So in many ways, he agrees with those who argue that contemporary atheism is caused or is the result of poor religious and poor theological education, which tends to present the idea of God simply as one responsive agent among others, rather than as the ground and depth of all responsiveness. Naturalism, he would say, sets up a false contest, nature rather than God. But that, I think he would say, is completely unnecessary. And as I've thought about the way of presenting this idea to students over the years, I've found it helps some of them at least to use this little picture of things, to develop a sense of layered explanation. If there's going to be compatibility or room for both natural explanations and theological explanations, in principle, you first of all have to make a case for the plausibility of layered explanation. And by layered explanation, I mean to point out to the simple fact that almost everything in our experience admits of a plurality of levels of understanding or explanation or reading levels. The example that I use with my students is that of a pot of water boiling on the stove in your kitchen. And someone comes into your kitchen and asks, "Why is that water boiling? Could you explain that to me?" And you could say in response, "It's boiling because the water molecules are moving around excitedly and they're making the transition from the liquid state to the gaseous state." And you could spend a whole career on that, and it's a fascinating thing, phase transitions. So let's take that explanation as far as we possibly can. But it wouldn't rule out another kind of answer: the water is boiling because I turned the burner on. And it wouldn't rule out an even deeper explanation, and this is probably the one you would have given right away: it's boiling because I want to make some tea. Now, the point of this simple example, it's an in-principle case, is that you can have multiple levels of understanding or explanation or reading levels without having them come into conflict with one another. There's no competition among these levels. In other words, you don't say to your friend that it's boiling because of molecular motion rather than because I want tea, or it's boiling because I want tea rather than because of molecular motion. I think in the theology science conversation, you have to make such a case, but it's very, very difficult to do, I have found, with scientific naturalists, because scientific naturalism is based on the assumption, the belief, and I use the term advisedly, that there's really only one explanatory slot available for all of us. And theology occupied that explanatory slot for centuries, but it didn't do a very good job. And when science came along with its natural explanations, theology had to get out, and now science can fill it. So the conflict, the so-called conflict between science and theology, is not a conflict between science and faith, but a conflict between two belief systems. One which believes that with Tillich, that reality is endlessly deep and therefore can admit of a plurality of reading levels or levels of understanding, and those who believe that there is only one way to understand reality now, and that's by way of scientific method. Just to give another example of what we might call explanatory pluralism or layered explanation, let's ask, why are there so many species of life? One answer, that from the biologists and evolutionists, because genes undergo mutations And there are many other levels, even within biology and the natural sciences, that you could bring in because of the self-organizing nature of chemical reality, physical reality, because of natural selection, genetic drift, environmental circumstances, deep time, and all those levels of understanding. But if you embrace an idea of layered explanation, it wouldn't contradict those to add also that there are so many species of life because of a divine concern for and delight in life's spontaneity, indeterminacy, and diversity. This approach was taken even in Darwin's day by Charles Kingsley, the Anglican divine, who wrote to Darwin and said, "Thank you for your beautiful picture of nature because it makes the idea of God all the more impressive and authoritative." It's not so much, Kingsley said, that God makes things as that God makes things that can make themselves. What a much more impressive universe, and how much more impressive a creator would be who makes that kind of universe. So for most Christians, Jews, and many people in the world today, including, I don't know the Muslim condition as well, there's no contradiction between evolutionary and theological accounts of life. So with that in mind, let's come back then to our question of understanding human responsiveness. If you ask the question, why are we endowed with this capacity to respond? Why are we caring beings? Why do we have moral aspirations? Why do we tend to cooperate and react and respond when people are ill? One answer, and we should push this as far as possible, it seems to me, is because cooperative behavior does help human genes get into the next generation. We should not immediately, from the point of view, it seems to me anyway, of the God religions, dismiss this natural explanation. But, as in the case of the boiling water, let's push it as far as we possibly can. In principle, it would not rule out even other secular explanations for why we are responsive beings, such as because moral responsiveness promotes human community and happiness. Nor would it rule out in principle a theological view. We are responsive beings because to be human means to be grasped, this is Tillichian terminology, by an ultimate, unconditional goodness. And this allows us, therefore, to come to a maybe different, I hope deeper, understanding of what the term reductionism really means. Usually when we talk about reductionism, we are talking about the tendency to break complex things down into their subordinate particulars and then to try to explain the whole in terms of the parts. But I think reductionism can have a deeper meaning. Reductionism, as I would understand it in terms of layered explanation, reductionism is the suppression of layered explanation. And this understanding of reductionism allows us, therefore, to see that certain kinds of theological explanation can be reductionist too. Someone who says, no, it's because of God rather than because of nature. When the famous Dover trial on evolution was taking place in Delaware some years ago, the way the media presented the issue for the trial was, is the diversity of life caused by God, a creator, or instead by natural selection? So even the way these issues are debated in the world of journalism is almost always an either or a rather than proposition. And at the same time, naturalism, it seems to me, has made a misuse of what's called Occam's razor. If you read Richard Dawkins, if he were here today, he would say, why do we need layers of explanation? We have one. And it's a very simple one. And doesn't Occam's razor say if you have a multiplicity of explanations, it's a good rule of thumb to pick the simplest. Well, that's not what Occam said. Occam said when you have a plurality of competing explanations, then a good rule of thumb is to take the one that makes the fewest assumptions. My point here has been that these are not competing explanations. So Occam's razor simply doesn't apply in this case. So finally then, just a snippet of how we might think of theology after Darwin and after Einstein in such a way as to allow for the complete play of scientific understanding and at the same time allow for the idea of a responsive God. The God religions, the Abrahamic religions, would understand ultimate reality as perhaps in a sense creating from the future. The world of biblical religion, as well as the Quran, I think, can think of God as calling not just Abraham, not just humanity, but now, in the light of modern science, the whole universe into the divine future. And couldn't we see the world, those 30 volumes that I showed you earlier, as a drama of responsiveness that goes all the way down, so that the story or the drama unfolds first at the level of matter, that the God of promise, the God who creates from out of the future, draws or calls life into being and sentience and consciousness, and then freedom and hope and responsiveness, without in any way suppressing scientific ways of thinking about these things. And wouldn't Darwin's recipe, which has been so problematic to many, which consists of 3 ingredients, lots of accidents, plus the law of natural selection, plus lots of time, make dramatic sense. Instead of looking for design in the natural world, architectural elegance, look at the universe as a drama. So let's switch our discussion of faith and evolution away momentarily from the question of whether organisms are intelligently designed, and see that what we have before us, what science has laid open to us, is a drama, and an unfinished drama, a drama of which we are a part. And since it's a drama, dramas are capable of carrying a meaning. But since the drama is still ongoing, we are not in a position yet to say what it is ultimately all about. So accidents would be necessary to open up the present to the future. Try to imagine what a world would be like without accidents. It would be so frozen, so stiff, so finalized, it would not even have room for a future. At the same time, any good drama has to have some backbone of consistency. So instead of looking at the laws of nature as signs of the ultimate impersonality of things and ultimately the unresponsiveness of the universe, see them as grammatical rules that make possible new meanings. The grammar remains the same from age to age, but that doesn't prohibit, if we switch the metaphor from law to drama, it doesn't prohibit new meanings from emerging. And think of cosmic time as essential for narrative depth. There's much more to be said on this, but I hope this will give you some sense of how at least some theology is trying to make room not only for science, but for the idea of a responsive God. Thank you very much.
We're actually going in evolutionary time in the history of world religions. That the youngest of the 3 Abrahamic faiths will be the last, and we'll ask back to the podium now Osman Bakar, who I will remind you is formerly Deputy Vice Chancellor of the University of Malaya and the Malaysia Chair of Southeast Asia Islam at the Prince Talal Al Walid Center for Muslim Christian Understanding at Georgetown University, and currently the Deputy Chief Executive Officer of the International Institute of Advanced Islamic Studies in Malaysia. And I already gave all the rest of the details of his extensive and impressive bio, so welcome back, Dr. Bakar.
Assalamu alaikum and a very good morning. Once again, see you all. I'm happy to see John here at this conference. After I have not met him for years since I left Georgetown. But when I was there, teaching there, he asked me to teach one of his classes. I gladly accepted the invitation. I enjoyed the class. It was on religion and science. And the interactions with the students were very good, entertaining. But I did not ask to be paid because I know that theologians, at least at Georgetown, don't have much money. But I know they help others to make a lot of money. But anyway, for my presentation today, I would like to illustrate the case for the intrinsic relationship between religion, ethics, science, and the practice of medicine in the Islamic perspective. I maintain the view that in the Islamic perspective, there is this intrinsic relationship between religion, ethics, science, and the practice of medicine. I would like to illustrate this relationship first through the discussion of sickness, which is a very important, which is a major component of the subject matter of medical science, and the other one through discussion of Tawhid, meaning principle or divine unity, which is the thread that runs through all aspects, dimensions of the cosmos, of the human world, human life, and thought. So I hope by the discussion of these two ideas, these two things, sickness and Tawhid, I will be able to present the case for this illustration of this intrinsic relationship. And in terms of sickness, I would like to refer to two hadith, two prophetic sayings, and the first one is this. Now, you see there is a sacred hadith. I don't know, maybe you know what this sacred hadith means, because for those who don't know, sacred hadith refers to a particular collection of hadith, sayings of the Prophet, in which God speaks in the first person. And that collection of hadith is called the sacred hadith. It stands between the Quran and the ordinary hadith. So this hadith, you can see in the first person, "O my worshipper, good health forms a link between you and yourself. Sickness makes a link between you and me." This hadith is a good commentary on the state of relationship between human beings and God. When in good health, a person tends to forget God, not to thank Him for his health. Indeed, he would attribute his health to himself. And this attributing everything to one's self is what in Islamic perspective is called the attitude of being self-sufficient, of thinking that one is self-sufficient. Now, so this attitude, this negative human attitude of self-sufficiency is a reproach in the Quran, because it is contrary to the virtue of humility. Whether it is self-sufficiency in relation to fellow human beings, or self-sufficiency more so in case with God, in relation to God. However, when afflicted with sickness, especially a severe one, a person tends to turn to God and to remember Him. He would pray to Him to restore his health. A person in sickness is a person in direct communication with God. Sickness opens a gate to God. Religion teaches that, I'm saying here about Islamic religion, teaches that the human responses, or the religion teaches what the human responses towards should be towards health and sickness. We should be thankful to God for both health and sickness. In the Quran, afflictions like sickness and others are considered as trials from God. God wants to test us human beings, but for many people see as tests only when they suffer, when they face difficulties, and when they're in sickness. But what actually the Quran teaches is that life, the whole life, is a trial. Health is a test in as much as sickness is a test. God wants to test our faith, to test whether we remember Him or not. So we should be thankful to God for both health and sickness. It is easy to understand why we should be thankful to God for giving us health. Health can only be good for us. But to be thankful to God for sickness, when He has taken away part of our health, that sickness is good for us is not obvious to many people. But Islam as a religion insists sickness is good. And we have to understand this religious perspective. So I just want to say a few things about this religious perspective about sickness. First of all, I want to say in general about religion as defined in Islam. Religion is defined in Islam as the meeting between God and human being. Religion is the total domain of encounters or meeting points between the divine and the human. And of course, Islam insists that there is nothing outside. There is nothing outside the domain. There's nothing in which we can say that the meeting between God and man is excluded. Now, in accordance with the hadith, which I'm just showing you, this hadith, sickness is integral to the religious consciousness, since it is a special meeting between God and human being. There are many kinds, many forms of meeting, and sickness is one of them. Religion also teaches that God is interested in our soul, because it is the soul that returns to Him. However, it is the healthy soul that God wants to welcome back to His presence and to be at His side. An unhealthy soul cannot return to the divine presence. It is in the nature of the divine presence not to admit unhealthy souls to His presence. Traditional Muslim psychologists, many of whom were physicians, dealt extensively with the issue of the state of the health of the soul on the basis of the Quran itself. The Quran speaks of the various states of the various states of and tendencies of the soul. The soul its healthiest, the soul in its healthiest state is referred to in the Quran as the tranquil soul, or the soul which is at peace with God and which is at peace with itself. Since I'm talking here about the return of the human soul to God, which is what death is all about, let me quote from the Quran God's welcoming address to all the blessed tranquil souls upon their return home to their divine origin. O you, the tranquil soul, return to your Lord, well pleased with him, and he with you. So enter among my servants, enter you among my servants, and enter you my garden. Now, what has sickness got to do with the health of the soul? Sickness provides opportunities for the soul of the person who is sick to become healthier through its acquisition of virtues such as humility, patience or forbearance, and human fellowship. Sickness nurtures humility, both humility before fellow human beings and humility before God. If one experiences a sickness and understands its meaning and significance in all its dimensions, partially its spiritual dimension, then he or she would be able to endure the sickness with patience. Sickness indeed nurtures patience. Since humility and patience are indicators of a healthy soul, the healthier soul that emerges from sickness has in turn a therapeutic impact on the physical body. The therapeutic value of spiritual health of the soul complements the physician's therapeutic input in helping to restore the balance that was lost from the sick person's total constitution. Thus, the sick person's positive attitudes toward and appreciation of the person's of the spiritual dimension of sickness can be of help to the physician in treating him or her. For this reason, there were many known cases in the past history of Islamic medical science and practices where the physician took upon themselves the task of deepening their knowledge of spiritual psychology. As you can see, even up to this point in my discussion, I have already illustrated that through the idea of sickness, the interrelationship between religion, ethics, science, and practice of medicine that is intrinsic in nature. The reality of sickness, as I said, which is an important component of the subject matter of medical science, helps us to see this intrinsic relationship in both theory and practice. I want to go to another hadith to help further strengthen this idea of interrelationship. O son of Adam, I fell ill, and you visited me not. So the son of Adam will say, O Lord, how should I visit you when you are the Lord of the worlds? And God will say, did you know not that my servant so and so had fallen ill, and you visited him not? Did you not know that had you visited him, you had found him with me? Or you have found me with him? So this hadith helps to project, among others, the idea of the dignity of the sick. God has given dignity to the sick, and this teaching has consequences on the attitudes of the healthy, especially relatives and friends, and the physicians as well, towards the sick. This hadith has been cited as the basis for the moral obligation on the part of Muslims to visit the sick. It is the moral obligation of the physician to treat his or her patient with dignity. And of course, this dignity extends to the treatment of the physical body. All of these requirements are on top of what God has already dignified him or her as a matter of birthright. Because like in Judaism and Christianity, Islam also believes that man has been created in the image of God. And of course, man is also created as the Khalifa, as God's vicegerent, God's steward on earth. So the respect for each human person extends to respect for the physical body. I just want to say here about the Islamic understanding of man, of human being, of human person has been created in the image of God, because it is related to some of the points that was raised by John in terms of responsiveness, precisely because we have been created in the image of God. In Islamic perspective, the understanding is this, that God has many names and qualities, best symbolized by the 99 beautiful names of God. These names and qualities are reflected in the human person, because that's the meaning of being imaged in the image of God. All the divine names and qualities are reflected on the human plane. Only that on the human plane, those divine names and qualities are referred to as human virtues, the virtues. So the acquisition of the virtues means the actualization of the names and qualities, divine names and qualities that only exist as a matter of potentiality in our being. It is through education and our life and thought, the full dimensions of Brahmanata will help us to actualize that. The point is this, from Islamic theology, from the point of view of Islamic theology, the person who is able to actualize in his or her being those names and qualities, that is referred to as the perfect man, al-insan kamil. So the goal of education, the goal of life, is to be this insan kamil. And since many of the qualities and attributes of God refer to the kind of mercy, love, and of human beings, so it is through the actualization of the names and qualities in the human and in the complete man that we have the virtues, the various virtues that are needed, of course, particularly in medical science by the physician, but also in other areas of life. So this was from my first attempt to illustrate, because I think if you look at these things, religion, ethics, science, medicine, practical medicine, you can see from my discussion just now that all these have entered into the discussion on sickness. Of course, religion is obvious from my presentation, and ethics. Ethics here, in Arabic in terminology, akhlaq and adab, I think tends to convey a much broader meaning, but more appropriate for the medical practice would be adab. Adab, because this refers to manners, approaches, the way we conduct our dealings with the others. And there's a whole literature in Islamic history where the adab for the physicians. Books were written on the adab of the physicians, how physicians should treat the sick. And of course, not only that, also the visitors, because Muslims have been encouraged to visit the sick. There's a whole literature about that. Religious discourses on the sick. Maybe if you go to many parts of the Muslim world and you see how the visitors, I mean those who visit the sick, there are some interesting differences. So there is a culture revolving around the issue of the sick. When you visit the sick, what to say to the sick, what to whisper to the ears of this, what particular prayer, dua, to be uttered, what to be brought and not to be brought, all that detailed accounts. From time to time, religious teachers in the mosque and so on will advise the people about these traditional practices, the responses towards the sick. I just want to go now to the other way of illustrating the intrinsic relationship. This is, as I said, through the idea of Tawheed. Tawheed means unity, but it refers to the principle of divine unity, the unity of God, which means the unity of the divine names and attributes, which I mentioned earlier. Now, of course, religion is central to all this, central of the four things we are considered: religion, ethics, science, and medical practice. Religion occupies the central place. Religion is, the core of religion is Tawheed, the unity of God, divine unity. Now, and religion is the source of science, is the source of medical knowledge, but there you can see I link religion to science through Tawheed and ethics. In my first presentation on Wednesday, I said Tawheed, the core of religion, but in the sense that it provides the beliefs, the knowledge, whereas ethics, which is contained in the Sharia, provides the guidelines on how to apply knowledge. So religion is linked to science both through Tawheed and ethics. Tawheed at the level of ideas and concepts, ethics at the level of practices. Same thing, religion is connected to medicine through Tawheed and ethics. And then you have the interrelationship between science and medicine. I maintained earlier that medicine is both a science and an art, and as a science, it is a branch of the biological sciences. But just now, I referred to psychology. The physicians, many of the physicians were also knowledgeable about psychology. So that science is not only the biological sciences, but also psychology, which is related to medicine in both theory and practice. Now I just want to go through a few slides illustrating that connection, the thread that connects the various sectors of human life, in particular science and medicine and religion and ethics. Here, the all-encompassing relationship. There are three core components of religion in Islamic teaching. religion has, in the sense of a deen, it has three core components, or three I's, I call that. The first I stands for Islam. Islam here, not the name of the religion, but rather a component of the religion, the external component of the religion, which deals with acts and practices in the sense of submission, the content of submission, which comprises the various acts and practices. And then the second I is Iman, which means faith. But faith here is not something that is separated from belief. So there is that close intertwining between beliefs and knowledge in faith. And Ihsan, which has been emphasized in some of the sessions here, parallel session, Ihsan means excellence in both Islam and Iman. And corresponding to these three dimensions of the religion, you have also the three core dimensions of the human constitution. The first component, the human being as an acting being. A human being is an acting being. That corresponds to the dimension of Islam. And the second thing, a human being is a believing and knowing or sentient being. That corresponds to Iman. And then a human being is a being striving for perfection, namely that inner drive to be the perfect man. And that corresponds to the dimension of ihsan or excellence. Now, there is also this intrinsic relationship. Here, Islam as a religion of truth and knowledge. The Quranic word for that is Dinul Haq, literally meaning a religion of the truth. So this intrinsic relationship between truth and knowledge, particularly that relationship between two divine names, Al-Haq, the truth, Al-Alim, meaning the all-knowing, the omniscient. And then knowledge as the path to salvation, both societal and posthumous. This is with regard to the question of the knowledge in which here Tawheed is the core. Now, then I guess further, the Islam's core doctrine, principle of Tawheed or divine unity. Now, principle of divine unity and Muhammadan apostleship. Actually, this is the foundation of Islamic epistemology. These two together is based on the two witnesses that everybody who is a Muslim has to utter. The witness that there is no God but God, and the witness that Muhammad is an apostle of God. So this, I refer to the foundation of Islamic epistemology and the foundation and sustainer also of the Muhammadan community. Now, divine unity implies unity of knowledge, which implies unity of the sciences. So the idea here is that there is no contradiction between, say, science and theology as the science of God. Of course, in practice, there are always challenges, and for example, John raised the question whether in Muslim thought, in contemporary Muslim thought, there is any kind of controversy or not regarding evolution. Certainly there is. But then I think the Islamic response on the whole to that is not the same as what we find within Christianity, but there's no doubt that modern discoveries in science do pose challenges and issues to theology. Now, but from the Islamic point of view, the most important science, because there is a belief here in a hierarchy of the sciences, that the sciences do not have the same epistemological status. So one is considered to be nobler than another or more fundamental than another. And in Islamic epistemology, the most central or the most important science is the science of divine unity, or ilmu tawhid, science of tawhid. And I just I don't have to go that because I think some of these have been mentioned in my first presentation. The meaning of science, how Islam understands the meaning of science, and so we have both the restricted meaning of science, science and meaning as the knowledge of the natural world, science of the physical cosmos. But there is also the more general meaning of science, meaning when you use the word science to mean also the social sciences and so on. So science with the plural ulum as a form of knowledge. And I've already discussed about the 4 structural elements that every true science has to possess in order to be considered as a true science. These I have as mentioned as well, the Sharia as a source of ethics. The Islamic divine law is the most important source of ethics. The Sharia, understood in its universal sense, serves as an all-encompassing body of principles and rules to guide human acts, individual and communal, in all sectors of human activities. And the Sharia is understood as the sum of the divinely given and the humanly interpreted and acquired. I talked already about the two parallel ethical traditions. First, we have the science of ethics, a very important branch of knowledge. Science of ethics, ilmu akhlaq, as a branch of the Sharia sciences, as well as a branch of the philosophical sciences. And there were two ethical traditions. One is among the jurists. So they developed the science of jurisprudence and ethics, particularly medical ethics. And then, because of that, you have the multi-dimensional character of Islamic ethics, bioethics, medical ethics, economic ethics, business ethics, and so on. Now, when we talk about ethics of knowledge, this is another important branch of knowledge that was developed by the Muslims in the past. Now, the most important kind of religious foundation for this is based on the Prophet's prayer. I seek refuge in God from unbeneficial knowledge. Although there was debate among Muslims in details what do you mean by this unbeneficial knowledge. And the ethics of knowledge here refers to the fact that to the dimension of production, application, and dissemination. And ethics is about usefulness and doing things correctly in accordance with the principle of unity of knowledge. The practice of science and medicine needs ethics. And here we refer to, and ethics should not be seen as something that is a kind of resulting in negative, the retardation in the progress of science and knowledge, but rather we should look at two aspects here. One is the creative aspect of ethics. So ethics has a creative aspect, and I mean here, I'm referring to the intellectual and scientific freedom that is necessary for the production of knowledge. And the other one is the regulative aspect. This is the avoidance of destructive practices. For that, we have also medical ethics. And then the challenge here is how to balance between these creative and regulative aspects of ethics. And finally, I just want to conclude my presentation here that I think I would like to affirm that there is indeed an intrinsic relationship that links religion, ethics, science, and medicine together in a unified way that demands a new approach to medical education. And religion plays an important role in this newly envisaged intrinsic relationship. Thank you very much.
If you would please come to the microphones for any questions or comments you have, so we can engage in discussion with our panelists.
Debbie Stolberg, University of Chicago. Thank you all. Those were great. And I think my question is maybe especially for Professor Hott. Am I saying your name right? So it's not so much on medicine and science and religion, but I appreciated your addressing the potential tension or lack thereof between sort of modern rational-based theory and life and traditional religions. I am a Reformed Jew. I'm both participatory in faith and faithful. I was bat mitzvah. I was married in a synagogue. I've been on committees in my synagogue. And I pray, and I'm religious in the way that a Reformed Jew can be. For me, a part of that faith, and I'll try to keep this brief, but I was educated by the late Rabbi Arnold Jacob Wolf here in Chicago, and when people approached him with the sort of basic question of, must a Jew believe in God in order to be a Jew? One of the answers I heard him give that stuck with me was, you have to be engaged in the question of God. And so I think of myself as faithful in that sense, and similarly, people have asked another rabbi, if there's evidence of that the Exodus did not historically exist as described in the Torah, is that a real threat? Do we need to defend that? And this rabbi answered, Reformed Judaism would say that's a distraction from what really matters about the story of the Exodus. So that's, sort of the context of my faith. And I don't think of myself as less Jewish than Jews who live their Judaism differently. But my concern is that, and maybe I'm a little defensive here, but I think this is relevant for Protestants and people of other faiths as well, that I think in the public square of ideas, I would be perceived as less Jewish, having less right to represent myself as coming from a Jewish perspective. And I think that's problematic for how religion speaks to the sort of key and central questions of our time. If people from the religious expressions or the denominations of the religion that don't perhaps, incorporate the religion into their everyday aspects of life, don't keep kosher, et cetera, are not heard or represented or represent themselves as equally religious, then I think the more liberal perspectives are considered not religious, or the religious perspectives are not considered consistent with. So I'm curious if you think, have we just done a bad PR job, or am I wrong and I really sort of am less Jewish and shouldn't speak Jewishly to some of these key questions? Thanks.
As you were talking, it occurred to me that Paul Tillich, whom I mentioned, was very much aware of the kind of question that you have. And he thought that the function of a good theologian today is not to get into too many arguments right away about the belief in a, say, personal, transcendent God, but to ask first the question of whether we are concerned with what he called the depth dimension of reality. He thought that reality consists of 4 regions: yourself, other people, nature, and history. In all 4 of those areas, our tendency is to remain on the surface as long as we can, until, he used very earthy metaphors, until an earthquake or a voice out of the depth occurs, and then we're invited to go deeper. And in this depth, he says, we find joy. He quotes Nietzsche on this point. So the important question is not whether, at least the important question first is not whether I believe in a personal God or not, but to what extent can I honestly say I am concerned for the dimension of depth. But then in his discussion with Einstein, he makes the same point and places himself very much in the spirit of Einstein as far as he can go. Einstein's concern for values and so forth shows that he certainly is a deeply religious man. The interesting question arises, though, and probably more within the different traditions than within people in general, as to what then would it mean to say that, to insist that God is personal. And the way he answered that question is to say that to be religious is to be grasped by something infinite, inexhaustible, deep. But if that depth is impersonal, if it's an it rather than a thou, he feared that that kind of understanding of ultimate reality would not grasp us at the heart of our being. So in his conversation with Einstein, he went as far as he could, but then he concluded in the end that for him, at least as a Christian, God has to be at least personal. God is more than personal. God is truth. God is goodness. God is the ground of being. And you can use all sorts of supra-personal or non-personal ways to think about God. And you have to get any sense of the breadth of the divine. But if you end up insisting that ultimate reality is an it rather than a thou, then ultimate reality is less than you are, because the most intensely real entity that we contact or encounter in our lives is persons who challenge us, who pull us out of ourselves. If ultimate reality is less than personal, then it can't be ultimate. That was his argument, and that's my own.
So I just want to say a word for Einstein and what I made of that comment, and to say thank you for raising the name of Abraham Joshua Wolf. A.J. Wolf he's an extraordinary thinker and quite a gift to Chicago, and a fierce defender of God's presence in the world. And so that's one wonderful thing about his name being mentioned. But I do think that to be a Jew is very hard. I was saying to John, Jews are harder on paganism than Christians have historically been. And oftentimes, so Judaism asks you, as I said in my talk, to act, and not just to think about acting, or to claim. So I'm always confused when people say, I'm not Jewish, but I have Jewish values, or I'm not observant, but I have Jewish values. I don't know what it means to have a value that is not a practice. And that action, that practice that shapes the world and shapes each of us as Jews in the world, I think has to be taken up at some point, or at least considered, engaged in, struggled with. So yeah, I do think things like struggling to keep kosher because of what we say about consumption, or struggling to make the cause of justice and the cause of the particular other that is the poor, which is a horribly difficult thing to do in modernity. To make that the focus of your life, in a way, of your practice, is really extraordinary. But it has to be something that comes from you. There has to be a practical aspect. And I think Einstein saying he was religious without content is complicated. Einstein was surely Jewish enough to be almost killed by Hitler's forces and to have to flee and to lose everything in Europe and have to come here and do it again. So surely he was a Jew. But to claim only that his religiosity meant that he didn't have any personal stake in it, it's always been troubling to me. I mean, he's like all Jews. He was in the middle of a continuum of praxis and relationship to God and to the people of Israel and to the creation of the state. There's always, to be a Jew and to be anyone in religion is to say there's always someone who's way more religious than you, and that's wrong, and someone who's not nearly enough as religious as you, and that's wrong too. And where you are is, of course, the perfect moment, right? Mm-hmm. And that's the one thing one can always say about this discussion within Judaism. So Einstein, it makes me sad to see Einstein played against this notion of religion, that he's the scientist, because he was such a complicated man in that way. But I do think, John, I just want to say, I mean, we said this earlier, and I want to say, I think that the new atheism is paganism, pure and simple. I don't think they're atheists. I think they do believe in a pagan view of the world, which is a view that reifies nature, that says nature is the focus of our attention and our delight, and that there's a spiritual presence in nature, or the system of nature, that is to be placed in the center of our understanding of the universe. And I think we make a mistake when we let them say that they're atheists. So, because we let go of the long and important history of opposition to paganism that's a part of monotheism. And we need to reinvigorate that discourse without fear of hurting their feelings when we point that out. So.
Michael Souter, an internist from Pennsylvania. My question is for Osman Bakar. I appreciated your insight about sickness helping the soul. And I summarize further, you said this therapeutic effect on the soul in turn aids the physician's therapeutic attempts on the body. I appreciate that and am encouraged by that because I'm looking for all the help I can get with my patients, many of whom I think leave the hospital after some mechanical manipulation but not being fundamentally changed or healed. My question is this therapeutic effect of sickness on the soul something that happens to everyone, something that's inevitable, or is it something that some patients can miss and only experience if their sickness is responded to in the proper way? And then if that's the case, how can I help them have that therapeutic benefit?
Yes, the question I think is how can sickness itself really be therapeutic for the soul, and to what extent can physicians help patients to have that experience, and can patients miss it without the help of physicians or perhaps their religious community helping them to understand the therapeutic effect of sickness on their souls?
We have different kinds of situations. There are those patients, those who are sick, who have already, instance before they got sick, they have already these positive attitudes towards illness, sickness, based on the knowledge that is being taught to them by religion. So that this kind of people, so even if the sickness becomes severe, even getting terminal, it is, in other words, because of this person's attitudes, positive attitudes towards sickness, and they understand, he or she understands the wider meaning of the spiritual significance. There's no question of the kind of experiences that we found in other cases. There are the cases where, because it's only when they actually get sick, especially when they get serious, then only they are taught, either by their somebody else, particularly in this case, the physician. So the role of the physician here, because that's why I emphasize that there are many Muslim physicians, who take the trouble to know also the nature of the soul, the various states of the soul, so that this doctor, this physician, can give help, psychological help. It's because it is believed that the psychological health is a very important, component. The psychological health contributes to the, how a patient should respond positively towards the disease. I think you have different situations. Say the more religious, I would say, the more religious have that, but the less religious is only one at the time of treatment. Then only you have to deal with the various kinds of emotional responses that are shown by the patient.
Right.
Alan Astro, I want to return to Einstein for a minute. So to prepare for the conference, I went to speak to a rabbi I respect, Saul Berman, who teaches at Stern College of Yeshiva University. He told me that from his standpoint, spirituality was awareness of God's virtues and values in the world, and holiness was the actualization of those virtues and values. So that sounded very much what Dr. Picar was saying about the holy person would sound like the Muslim perfect person. So it's not surprising, just a different way of how you get to know God's virtues and values. But what did surprise me is it sounded very much also like Einstein's definition of spirituality, because he said, the way you quoted him is, he felt that the religious person had to be aware or conscious of overarching virtues and values. It's just he doesn't acknowledge that, he doesn't say the God's virtues and values. But then the question is, what do we know about Einstein? What's the source of his understanding of what the virtues and values are? And what's his ties to the Jewish community? And in fact, is he denying what may be true, which is he's just Jewish, and what he's claiming are these virtues and values he got from nowhere, in fact, Jewish values that he learned as a kid? That might be my question.
Well, just very briefly, a good question, where is he coming from? When he was still a very young man, he started reading a very, very difficult book by Baruch Spinoza, The Ethics, and he said that was what shaped his whole life, including his idea of God. As you recall, for Spinoza, there is no distinction between the world and God. Deus sive natura, God or the world, take your pick, whatever name you use. But since God exists necessarily, the world exists necessarily for Einstein, until, of course, he came into contact with his own theory of relativity, which others showed him that the world may not have existed necessarily. If it were necessary, it would have existed eternally. So much of his spirituality was based on a Spinozist assumption that the universe is necessary, that the universe is eternal, and therefore the universe is determined to be what it is. And that's why his notion of scientific law really in many ways was formed by his religious attachment to Spinozist ideas rather than to the history of science.
From Islamic point of view, there is a verse in the Quran that in the remembrance of God, you find the peace and tranquility of your heart. And as a cardiologist, I've seen in my practice when I discuss with a patient, besides the other options, is that if they believe in God, try to connect with God in whatever denomination there allows them to remember God. And many of these patients, they come back and tell me, yes, I feel better. In what way? Well, blood pressure is better, the heart rate is better, and overall anxiety is less. So there is a connection from Islamic point of view between the medicine and the divine. One of the things earlier mentioned that there's no God, no personal God and no God in life. Now let's look at this thing. Every country has the head of the country, or the president or the king. Every corporation has the head of the president. Every family has the head of the household. Now, when we look at this thing, the sun, moon, all the planets, everything, looking at the worldly law, everything has a leader. And I'm sure by keeping that in mind, this universe must have also a head of this universe who created and maintaining the same way. If you look at the moon on the 14th night, every year, time and again, you will see the same picture of the moon. So it must be only one God keeping everything in the same order and the same seasons every year. So there's got to be someone managing the universe, and it has to be only one. Thank you.
Yeah, with regard to the remembrance of God, of course, I mean that that is the central teaching. Why do we exist? Because we are supposed to for the remembrance of God. Now, anyway, I'm not going. I just want to touch here about the practical dimension of it. Today, for example, there are I know in certain parts of the Islamic world, including my country, Malaysia, there have been medical students carrying out research on this, doing on those whose lives have been devoted to remembering God. I mean, in a sense. And their spiritual life is that, and they try to see the impact of their remembrance of God on the state of their mind. What sort of you mentioned about the tension and so on. Precisely based on the Quran that those who remember God will find peace in their heart, and now they want to verify that empirically by using modern methods. This is sophisticated also technology and approach to, to verify that.
Use the Deuteronomy 22 passage. If you see your neighbor's ox wander off, you have a duty. Don't hide yourself if you see him suffer loss. And then it seemed in your talk you generalized that. And my question is, in the Christian tradition, the parable of the prodigal son who suffered loss, losing his whole inheritance on riotous living, and then he ended up in the pig pen, and that's when he came to his senses. So are there times, or do you have a distinction when you allow, or when you see loss as a natural consequence, which is what we deal clinically and as parents, et cetera, where there's these natural consequences where we allow them to suffer loss? Is there a way you reconcile those?
Yes. I teach Levinas, so I'm with him. He's my guy on this. I'm not concerned with what got you there. You're there. Your loss presents itself as an event for me, as an encounter for me. And it's my duty, and I better think a lot about my duty, not your, you the loser, and not judge the loser. The loser's there in my life, and I have an utter obligation, a ceaseless obligation to help him, no matter what got him in the pig pen, right? And you would never allow that to happen if you could avoid it. So I think it's, for me, the Deuteronomy is extremely clear. And it's really hard because it's said again and again and again. Everyone's given an equal share in the land, and somehow your neighbor messes it up. Locusts come, he drinks too much, whatever. You have to take him in, you have to have him in your house, on your couch, for as long as he needs, right? And so the ceaseless, utter sense of focus on my duty, not on what he did to get there, and judging that whole thing or seeing it as a lesson to him. And that's part of the anxiety that Judaism has around seeing suffering as some sort of a corrective, right? In many parts of the tradition, it's a big tradition, and Jonathan can tell me there's many parts in the tradition where suffering is struggled with as possibly redemptive or corrective. But in the larger normative sense, it's useless. And what it is about, don't think about that, don't judge the other, it's about how I give utterly, my duty. The focus is on and the actions of the self, the duties of the self, not the rights of the other, which is somewhat helpful in thinking about this. It's not about defending rights. It's about thinking about your correlative duties. That's why you can't make a call for human rights unless you're completely devoted to the duty to create that situation for the other. So just what you're focusing on.
Before I invite Fark Curlin to the podium for our concluding remarks, let me extend my thanks to the panel, and I'm sure that of all of the audience here. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Well, I certainly add my thanks to the panel as well, and I'm going to pick up with that last question and Professor Zola's response. For an array of reasons and all sorts of causes, people get sick, and they, in their sickness, make a claim, a call that we can perceive, that healthcare professionals in particular perceive themselves to be called by. And the question to which this conference intended and intends in the future to respond is what would it mean to respond to that call faithfully? As individuals, as institutions, as churches, as synagogues, as communities of faithful people, Jews, Christians, Muslims, and recognizing we can't specify that in one language that we would all can grasp onto as making sense of how we ought to respond. Through this last 48 hours, we've tried to think about and get a better purchase on how religion and ethics and science relate to one another, how they relate to the practice of medicine. I hope in some way in your own mind you feel like you've gotten some more clarity, or at least a sense of direction in some questions you want to resolve as you think about that in your own context. We've asked whether medicine, and by medicine we meant really the sort of the healing arts, the response to the sick that we engage in our professional roles is a spiritual vocation, can be thought of that way. And I hope that you have in some way gained some ideas, some direction, some clarity about how that might be. And again, a sense of where you want to go to come to greater clarity about it. We've asked why we ought to be, why we ought to enter our professions, why we ought to continue them, and tried to look into the religious traditions, the particularities of specifically Judaism, Christianity, and Islam to make sense of that and to give voice to that. And I'll just say along the way, I've had moments of being really inspired. I've had moments of being confused, moments of being perplexed, and moments of sort of seeing with new clarity. And I think what my guess is all of you have had on some level, all of those different moments. And the experiment will go forward. We will be in touch with you in the coming weeks as we try to clarify dates for next year. We'll be in touch with you in the late summer and early fall with a call for submissions. If there's something that you sensed really you hungered for that was missing in this conference, I encourage you to make a submission to try to fill that gap. And also to express what that is. You've got in all of your packets, you have evaluation forms. Please fill them out. One comment written in a sentence will probably be even more valuable than checking all the boxes. So please let us know how we can do a better job at cultivating this work and being a resource to you and to others like you. You also have, again, very concretely, if you would like CME, you need to turn in your CME request form, so please do that. If you're interested in the Jummah prayers today, remember that folks are going to meet at 12:45 in the lobby to go to those prayers, and there will be rides available to come back. There is in your form, or in your packet, a form in which you can volunteer to be a part of a community of people that are trying to shape this as it goes forward. And I would encourage you to consider doing that. And I want to thank a few people. Certainly want to thank all of you who came and participated and listened and asked questions. Thank you for being a part of this. I want to thank all of our speakers who came from, in many cases, long distances to be a part, and I thank you for the work you put in to contribute to this. Dan and I, and certainly all of us involved in this, offer our thanks. I want to thank our staff, who I think have done a terrific job, I hope you'll agree, in making sure this came together and the logistics came off well. In particular, Daniel Kim and Anikia Miller and Kelly Wollenberg, who you've seen around, the CME staff, Sandra Beauford, Mahira Bonomo, and Marquetta Lewis, who you've seen behind the desk. I want to thank them for the work that they've done to bring this together. And we hope to see you again in other venues, and certainly again next year. And as you go out, I want to wish you and pray you grace and strength and courage in your efforts in your own sphere to respond faithfully to the call of the sick, and to be arm in arm in helping your colleagues to do the same. Thank you very much, and I hope to see you next year.